Welcome to the Inside Silverstone podcast, a business-focused podcast covering all things tech, engineering and innovation. Hosted by me, Chris Broome, a huge tech, motorsport and gaming fan, and also the owner of Longhurst, a firm of lifestyle financial planners and independent financial advisors located in Silverstone, Northamptonshire. This is a series of unscripted and unpolished conversations with leading business owners, thought leaders and high-tech talent where we discuss their experiences within the Silverstone business and motorsport region. We will also be asking them to share their knowledge, insight and their thoughts on the future just for you. If you're looking to learn more about the Silverstone high growth region and commercially connect with like-minded peers, you've definitely come to the right place. Welcome to Inside Silverstone. Welcome to the next edition of Inside Silverstone. My name is Chris Broome and I am your host. Today I am delighted to welcome to the show Clive Hartley, who is founder of Quarteere. Clive, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Clive, as is customary, as I always explain, as all my dear listeners, wonderful listeners will be getting bored of me saying this, I'd love to quickly run through a quick education and career background, if that's okay, just to help explain and highlight your sort of skills and the journey you've been on, and also to why we sort of asked you to come on the show. So is that okay if I quickly do that?
Sure, no problem.
So I got all this information off LinkedIn, so if any of this is incorrect, do correct me. But education-wise, basically did and got a transport design degree from the University of Coventry, and then followed up with a master's, again in vehicle design from the Royal College of Art.
That's right, yep.
Career-wise, basically spent the early part of your career, the first decade, working in sort of the automotive field, design world, initially starting at Daimler Chrysler, then moving to Nissan, and then moving to Porsche Design.
That's right, yeah.
So let's talk about that quickly before we get on to obviously what you're doing now. So big names there, and clearly Porsche Design. So, you know, what was it like working for Porsche, and what did you actually do?
Porsche Design was a really interesting place to be. Porsche Design Studio is separate to the car company and is the studio that was founded by Ferdinand Porsche after the Porsche family stepped back from the running of Porsche cars in the 70s.
Right.
He moved back to where he grew up in Austria, in Zell am See, and set up an industrial design studio. And that, about 10 years ago, was bought, or slightly more, was bought back by the Porsche Group and brought under their control. And that was the point at which I came in to manage their transport design studio within Porsche Design. So we worked on public transport, we worked on some vehicle design for other companies, airplane interiors and things like that, which was really interesting, and a lot of boat design as well. So there was quite a nice scope there, and it was an interesting change for me after having worked for car companies for several years to sort of spread the scope of what I was doing and understand also how a consultancy needed to work after working on the inside of large OEMs, to understand what were the kind of the key skills that you needed to have when you were working as a consultancy, in terms of empathy, listening to your client, agility in terms of being able to react very quickly to demands, and also how you communicate the steps of the design process so that the client that you're working for understands exactly what you're doing and why it's valuable, why it's useful for them. And I think that was kind of a really important grounding, because suddenly you're forced to see it from an outsider's point of view, whereas working in a car design studio, you're surrounded by other car designers, and you all kind of speak the same language, and you all understand the same things, like how to read a design sketch. And when the first time you realise that somebody who's not been working in that business for 20 odd years doesn't see the same things in the sketch that you do, is kind of what? It's like realising that somebody's perception of colour is different to yours or something.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's really important, because it then makes you, assess your own, the way you approach your work and appraise how you're explaining it to other people. And I think that's been an important learning skill when we were setting up Quarteere as well.
And so just to sort of conclude on the Porsche bit, so presumably you were working over in Austria, were you?
Yeah, that was right. I was very lucky to work in the middle of the Alps in Zell am See, which is a beautiful part of the world. And I was living in Salzburg at the time, which again, very beautiful. Watching The Sound of Music constantly.
Yeah.
No. It's interesting. No, very few people know of that film over there.
Oh, really?
Yes, and they're all surprised when you tell them that you can walk across the border from Salzburg to Switzerland.
Fine. And so after Porsche, so 2010, you co-founded Quarteere.
Well, that was sort of not quite the next step. I moved back to London to do some freelancing with one of the friends that I then founded Quarteere with, Nick Mannion. He and I were doing a lot of work for Lego, who's still one of our clients at Quarteere, and then together with Daniele Cecchimori and Jason Pawlowski, the other founders of Quarteere, we started looking into some projects that we wanted to do for ourselves, which was, we're all keen cyclists, and we were all, as designers, we were all interested in things like furniture design, and we set up Quarteere initially as a vehicle for creating our own products. And then what happened was, because we were all working as freelance designers anyway, and we were all helping each other with projects and working together on those, it became a natural thing actually to turn the company into a consultancy. So Quarteere was founded about 9 years ago, and then probably since the last 5 years or so, we've been working fully as a consultancy with clients sort of around Europe and in the UK.
Okay, and so before we get on to obviously the consultancy piece and some of the projects you've been working on, presumably you've designed some products yourself. So you said that was part of the genesis where you wanted to create some of your own.
Yeah, that's right. We started off, we made a range of furniture which we called Furniture for Bikes, because it came from a kind of a crux that we all had, where we were living, all of us living in London, space is limited, we all had probably slightly more bikes than we should have had, and not much outdoor space to keep them. So we wanted to create, there were hooks available where you could hang your bikes on the wall, but they're generally all kind of quite industrial and ugly looking things, so you didn't really want to have that in your house. So we wanted to create something that had the same function, was just as practical, but actually looked more like a nice piece of furniture. And even if your bike wasn't on it, it might be a nice thing leaning against the wall or hanging off the wall. And that was what we started off doing, and that was interesting for us because we looked around to find manufacturers in the UK, so we'd get everything made in the UK. And it was an education in seeing what companies were out there that could do folded sheet steel, powder coating, machining wood, where we could source components for nice bolts and fittings, and then also looking at the retail and marketing side of that, because then when you produce your own products, you've got to sell them. So learning what the dynamics were in the furniture world, in the bike world. And I think we were one of the first companies that was sort of trying to chase that market. And I think there's more companies now, but certainly back in the day, like 10 years ago, it was quite we were finding that bike shops didn't really want to sell kind of high-end bike stand products, because they were all about sort of just selling. Most shops were about selling as much product as they could in a smaller space as possible. And furniture shops were interested, but were then, well, shouldn't that be in a bike shop? Whereas now you see a much more crossover with that, and I think that's reflecting on how cycling has grown as kind of a lifestyle thing for a lot of people in big cities. Even in the UK, where I think it happened more slowly than on the continent, I think, for instance.
Okay, and so in relation to sort of day-to-day, Quarteere, as you've said, provides sort of consultancy services to a wide range of businesses. And so what's a typical business look like? Where are they located at the moment for you? And
a lot of our clients are in continental Europe, so we work with companies in Germany, so tier one suppliers to the automotive industry. As I mentioned, we work with Lego in Denmark, doing a lot of work with them on all aspects of their business, which ranges from the toys that you see in the toy shops through to the charitable work that their foundation does in promoting education through play, which is really interesting. And
so just on that point, so what's your involvement? So what have you been doing with them for that?
Well, we've done for the education in play specifically. What we've been doing there is helping them develop kits that they can send out to different parts of the world to help educators encourage kids to experiment creatively and practically solve problems, and experiment in a way where they're not it encourages them not to be afraid of failing, and also encourages them to be open-minded in terms of picking up all sorts of materials and mixing them together to make structures, and experimenting iteratively to create, okay, that first one didn't work because it didn't balance very well, but if I add this bit, it will balance better and we'll do this better. And what we've been doing is helping them create kits for educators to do these activities, and then creating kind of instructions and experiences around those. It's sort of one of the things we've discovered is that when you give somebody a blank sheet of paper and say, right, do something creative, it's really difficult.
Yes.
Whereas if you kind of give them a little bit of a frame to work within, all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier. And part of what we do is to create that frame in ways that are hopefully not too dictatorial, but ways that are just encouraging them to sort of take jumping off points. And I think that's been quite interesting for us, because that's something that you can apply back into the design process itself, because that's effectively what you're encouraging kids to do, is to sort of become young designers.
And these kits are sent around the world? Around
the world to parts of Asia, Africa, and it's they're given out free of cost by Lego's foundation.
Sure.
And again, I think that's an interesting thing then to start. When I think back to my own education at school and in a university, how we were taught about design and how we were taught about creativity, I think sometimes there's an assumption over here that it's just something that happens and that some people are kind of naturally creative, where there are actually things you can do to encourage people to develop those skills in the same way that people train to be athletes.
Sure.
I think there are ways that you can practice exercises to encourage you to think creatively, or encourage you to think about when you have a problem or a challenge, how you can think around that and how you can solve that. And that's, again, as I said, there's a sort of a feedback loop, because once you're forced to think about that, think about that for someone else, you then start to appraise what you do yourself.
Yes.
And that's been really interesting for us. And I hope it's made us better designers as well.
Oh, no doubt. I had, as I do, a good read and flick through your website, which is a great website.
Thank you.
And on there, as I would expect, hopefully, from a design consultancy, but on there were some fantastic and very interestingly sounded projects. And so if it's okay, what I'd like to do is just reel off a few of these just to understand a little bit more about why you engaged in the project, and really what happened and what the outcome was, if that's okay. Certainly because some of these will definitely have a very useful synergy with life in Silverstone Park and Silverstone Technology Cluster and the member firms within. So the first one is autonomous delivery. So talk to me about autonomous delivery.
This was an internal project, a research project that we've sort of been playing with over the last year or so, where we were looking at autonomous vehicles and how people were predicting they could be used, but we were also starting to see the impact of last mile delivery on services that companies like Amazon provide, and the post office and UPS and people like that. And it started us thinking about how you can use delivery vehicles and what sort of job they perform. And one thing was that we were seeing that there's this, with the sort of the Amazon drop-off lockers, you could see that there was a move towards a sort of a localization of pick-up and drop-off points, because it's easier rather than driving vans around to every single destination. And what you see in London, for example, is that people get stuff delivered to work because they're not at home. So you get vans driving around crowded city centres, and because of the nature of those deliveries, often, I think I read something like more than half the vans driving around London have something like only a third of carrying only a third of the cargo that they could be carrying, which actually means that it's kind of starting to get within the range of a cargo bike even. So it's not, it's actually a transit van is almost overkill for some of those deliveries. And when we started to look at how you could have drop-off and pick-up points, it started us to think, well, is there a way you can use that to sort of reinvent the post box, and reinvent how things like the red letter box and the red telephone box have become kind of icons of our street furniture, and they become identifiers for a place. And we started to look at, in the same way, the Route Master buses as well. It was kind of those sort of three things for us were an interesting kind of intersection of street furniture and vehicle design. And it started us to think about, could you create an autonomous vehicle that stopped off in places, you were informed that it was there for a certain amount of time, and it allowed you to go and pick up pick up a parcel, drop off a parcel, but then also actually could you build things into that became a space for socialising in the same way that people meet when they go to the post office. Can you start to encourage that through the design? So I think one of the designs we put a little pocket park on the vehicle itself as a way of saying, actually, when you pick up your parcel, you can sit down there and open it up or read the letter that you've got, or if you need to wrap something up, you can do that there. And that started us then to think about, well, what other vehicles are there that kind of stop in places for a long time? One of the points being, and one of the reasons we were looking at things like phone boxes and letter boxes is that once that vehicle is stationary, it's kind of becoming a piece of street furniture. And it would be nice if actually when it was stationary, it wasn't just another parked car, it was something that added to the nice appearance of a street, because everybody benefits from that, even if it's just a feel-good factor. But then it started to think about all the other things you see, so like the old corrugated Citroen vans that are used by so many companies as a coffee shop. And it's like, well, could you start to kind of create a 21st century version of that, where you actually use it as a platform for encouraging small businesses, because ground rents are so expensive in big cities. So actually, a local authority could have a fleet of these that they use as effectively an accelerator and incubator for small businesses that are providing services by stopping off in certain points, and whether that's they pitch up for the entire day, they pitch up for half a day, or they kind of flow like the tide with commuting patterns. And I think that was for us a really interesting way of reframing what autonomous vehicles could do. And that was kind of one of the things where we were scratching at the surface at with that project, and something that we're still looking at now, and ways we can do that either with a client or looking at sort of taking that project to the next step and looking at how we can develop kind of functional prototypes.
Okay. I've also seen on the website two projects relating to EV, electric vehicles. So we've got EV interior, and we've also got the Nissan EV glider. So let's start with the interior, because I was quite interested in that. The imagery that you put on the website it looks very good.
The interior was we did a project for a client where we were asked to help them create a vision for how the interiors of autonomous cars could look, and how that might change, how the current kind of car interior architecture might change when you no longer need to drive and face forward in that kind of cinema seating. And the project that's on the website shows ways that you can apply functionality basically to create different scenarios where you can face each other, you can talk, you can have a social space, or you can kind of move the seat around and to give yourself a degree of privacy. And it's things where we picked up on stuff that we've seen happening on public transport or in aircraft interior design, where people want to be together at times, but then other times they want to be able to have their own space. And this was for a client who works creating interior components for the automotive industry and public transport, and it was a way for them to showcase that they have a vision of how the future of interiors is changing because of the technology that's coming online. But also that the practical innovation and technology that they're producing can facilitate that by giving you this added functionality in interior in terms of seats that allow a flexible setup, storage spaces, deployable tables and things like this. And what's nice about that is that's a relationship that's been ongoing, and we're sort of developing these ideas further and looking at other aspects of those. But I think it's important for us to, as a transport design studio, to look at how technological developments are going to change the soft parts of cars, and they're going to change the interface with people, because actually the way we use them is going to change and the user experience is going to change. So that was what that was an investigation into, was sort of creating a very visual way of communicating the ideas and the technology of this client to say, look, this is actually what these interiors could be. They might not be like that, and they won't all be like that, but it's the potential.
I think it's fantastic. I was excited when I saw it. I thought, God, that'd be great. If you're sitting there and you're on an hour's journey or commute, and you're potentially going with colleagues or family, but where you can, as you said, you can socially interact. You could potentially have a meeting whilst you're going, but then, as you said, you can then sort of turn around and sort of maybe get on your laptop or have a quick snooze, or literally just have some personal time, as you've said. So.
And I think, as anyone that's got a family and has driven on a a long holiday with the kids in the back, and that you start to think about how you're interacting, and also how difficult it is to hold a conversation when you're trying to look over your shoulder when you should be looking at the road ahead, or even if you're the passenger, then continue having to reach around to hand drinks and food or whatever.
No, I think it's great. And so then there was also something to do with Nissan and a glider. So what?
I worked for Nissan when they set up their London studio back in the day, as did my partner Daniele Cecchimori and Jason Pawlowski also. And the glider was a project that was created for Nissan Design Europe for the London Design Week, I think it was, to help them showcase what they're doing with electric vehicles, or what they would, and that was a few years ago. So it was when the Leaf was first coming out, and they wanted to kind of make a statement that they were really looking into this field. So that, again, this was a communication tool to show this is the potential of what Nissan are doing, and this is kind of they're willing to push this as the sky's the limit, literally in this case. And it's interesting now to see, looking at projects like that, where it's about communicating a vision, then to see how it's gradually coming into reality. And I was at a conference the other day where there was a guy from Rolls-Royce Aerospace who was talking about flying taxis and the potential of those, and how the challenge for electric planes is the weight of the batteries, and how, unlike burning off fuel, where the plane gets lighter over the duration of a journey, with the batteries it doesn't, which means for some long-haul applications, it's not really a goer at the moment. But actually, for these small city-to-city, point-to-point journeys, they're kind of an interesting thing. And I think it's one of these things like that are interesting, because it's another one of the different modes that could be useful for cities. And I don't think any one of them on their own represent a silver bullet, but actually when you start to look at how you can use them usefully, that gives all the people that are making slightly different types of journeys, different options for what they do. And I think that's what, and it's like biodiversity in a way. I think a healthy ecosystem needs a good diverse range of plants and animals, flora and fauna. And I think you could argue that you need that same kind of biodiversity, for whatever the proper term is, in terms of modes of transport for a city. You need people to be able to choose between walking, cycling, driving, getting a train, a bus, a tram, flying point to point, because that allows you to have the options, and it allows you to work around problems when they arise, and they always will arise. So it's always, for us as a transport design studio, it's always interesting to have the chance to look at these different sort of solutions and look at those different ways of creating transport solutions.
And so you've mentioned bikes. So I've also seen that you have a project called REAP triathlon bike. And that interested me, just from a sort of aerodynamic perspective and potentially relationships on site. So and also because you clearly have a big interest personally, as does the team, in obviously riding. So what was that project? That was
REAP's a fairly young company, British company, that are making triathlon bikes here in the UK. And the triathlon bike that we created for them was their first product. And so our brief was to create something that was aerodynamically, if not top of its class, right up there with the best, but also a visual, really striking visual statement as kind of the first entry of this brand into the market. So we created this triathlon bike, which has this kind of cantilevered top tube, top beam rather, to give a very kind of dynamic visual appearance. But then also we worked with Total Sim here, looking at the aerodynamic performance of the bike. They scanned in, I think Harry Wiltshire, one of the triathletes who REAP sponsor, on his bikes, and then created digital models to analyse the performance of the data that we were creating for the design of the bike, and then which was really great for us, because we were able to create our digital design model, which they could then analyse for its aerodynamic performance, give us feedback on where it worked well, where it would be great if we can make changes. But it also helped us to understand, with triathlon bikes, what might be a great aerodynamic package dead ahead, actually the minute you get a side wind can suddenly act like a sail. So it was an interesting exercise to work through with Total Sim to understand what the best compromise was for a triathlon bike, and to understand how the athletes use the bikes to to get the best performance and how they need the bike to behave. And so this, that was a really interesting one for us, because although we've done a lot of other bike projects, they've not really been performance bikes like that, or racing bikes. So to understand the importance of the aerodynamics of the bike and understand how it's affected by the rider, the size of the rider, how it's affected by the angle of incidence of any prevailing winds, was a real education. And it did. One of the things I remember was that basically, if you want to save weight off your bike, don't bother buying the titanium bolts. Just only half fill your water bottle.
There it is. Yeah. And presumably, you've ridden these bikes. Do you even have one?
No, we've got a prototype in the studio. Unfortunately, I've not had the chance to ride one yet. I'm not sure I'd be very good on it.
Fine. And earlier, you spoke about obviously the sort of legacy relationship and an ongoing one with Lego. And so I've seen on the website something to do with the Lego house as a project. So what was that? Because that's clearly very, very different, I'm thinking anyway, to sort of autonomous vehicles and EV and what have you. Or is it?
Yes and no. The Lego house came from one of the relationships of one of my fellow directors, Nick Mannion. And what we were part of there was the team that developed the experiences inside Lego House. So Lego House is effectively a brand experience centre for Lego. It's the home of the brick.
And where is it?
It's in Billund in Denmark. So it's the hometown of Lego. It's where they have all their HQ and their design studio. It's a small town. It's a small rural part of Jutland. So it's quite a big attraction in what's otherwise kind of quite a quiet area. Designed by big architects, so a major firm from Copenhagen, and we worked on the inside. So what they wanted to show was all the ways that you can play with Lego, all the aspects there are of the play experience. So we helped Lego create a number of experiences within the building where you could play with Lego in different ways. You could build things with friends, you could build on your own, you could make movies, you could interact. And what we created there was these experiences that often went from physical into digital, where we had to craft the experience, as it were. So not just coming up with the idea of what could you do, but then look at how you did it and how you could guide kids and adults through that without from beginning to end, without having to have a system of traffic lights or big klaxons going off saying, right, that bit's finished, move along now, please. Where it became natural, and you kind of you encourage people to progress rather than sort of telling them they had to watch the clock. And what's been interesting from that project, and why I think it is related to some of the autonomous vehicles and public transport work we do, is because that we had to look at the same kind of motivators and drivers for people, how you nudge people to progress with what they're doing, how you explain to them what they can do or how they can make something work. And it's always been a sort of a joke of ours that the number of things we've learned observing kids playing that you then see are 100% applicable to adults looking at luxury cars, for instance. There's some sort of behavioural patterns that kind of stay with you, into adult.
Yeah, they're ingrained. Human nature. And so as a design agency, consultancy business, what is your main focus?
We're a transport design agency, and I think on top of that is user experience. Okay. Physical user experience, physical into digital. We talk about our work as being about people, places and product. So that's looking at the user, looking at the context that a service or a product is going to be used in, and then using the learnings from that to actually craft the end result. So a lot of the work we do is now moving into the area of helping people find opportunities for their businesses. So it becomes almost design strategy a little bit, as well as looking at the actual products themselves. It's for the company, how can they maximize the returns from what they're doing? How can they find new markets for the technologies they're working on? And often that's in terms of looking at what's out there and where the gaps are. Sometimes it's looking at other fields that you can apply their technologies to that they might not have noticed or might not have thought about, or ways that you can expand their offers, sort of eat low-hanging fruit that's surrounding them, saying, well, you're working on X, but actually if you started looking at this as well, you could offer a slightly bigger, more complete service. And I think that's been one of the interesting things of the discussions we've had with people we met through Silverstone Tech Cluster has been understanding some of the incredible technologies that people are working on here, but then being able to connect dots either between different members or between things we've seen or projects we've been working on for clients, and saying, actually, if we could sit down with you guys, we could talk about how we could use the technology you're developing to create this kind of end product or use it in this kind of service. And I think for us, that's a really interesting, it's a really rewarding sort of piece of our work, because it's always nice to meet new people. It's always nice to kind of connect people and see them actually, find useful professional relationships. And that's also been something where making those connections and seeing those patterns, I think, is really educational and really informative to what we do.
And presumably it's for all of those reasons that you joined the Silverstone Technology Cluster,
Definitely,
STC. Yeah. And so you joined last year?
Beginning of last year we joined. We met, as I think most people would expect, because of the surname of one of the directors of the company. Mm-hmm. Jason Pawlowski got in touch with Sally Powolowski, who's also a member of the STC, I believe. We got to know her at, I think we met at the Autosport show last year, talking about kind of shared areas of interest in design and the automotive sector. And she introduced us to Pim, who told us all about the Silverstone Tech Cluster, and that was a gateway to joining, and because we were making a bit of a push to kind of get to know more companies in the UK, get to know more companies that are working in the kind of the high-tech automotive sector, because we'd seen how it had been useful to other projects, and STC was is a perfect sort of organisation to help us do that. So it's been really useful for us.
And how has it gone so far? Have you sort of interacted in some of the sort of networking groups and sessions?
Yeah, we joined one of the special interest groups, the ACES one. That's because that's particularly relevant to what we do, and we've been along to some of the talks and meetings there, which has been really interesting. So the last one was it a month ago or so? There was some talks about the Chinese market. There was Tomorrow's Journey. Chris Kirby was there talking about their service, and so all of that is really interesting to see. Just whether it's something like Tomorrow's Journey, where it's an interesting concept and it's an interesting way of utilising the assets that are often sat idle for 90% of their time, through to meeting companies where you think, actually, we've been looking for somebody that's working on electric motors, so can we, let's sit down and talk, or let's arrange that meeting one-to-one. So that that's been really useful, and so we've been up to Milton Keynes a few times for the talks as well. So,
and so presumably, and from what you've spoken about over the last sort of half hour, there's clearly a mobility focus from Quarteere's perspective. So presumably, becoming part and joining the STC, you're hoping to build, clearly relationships and friendships, but perhaps even collaborative partnerships with some of the other member firms.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's areas we've been looking at. I mean, the autonomous delivery vehicle that's on our website, that was kind of, if you like, our first exploration into this area of electric commercial vehicles and what you can use that as a platform for. So I think we're interested in talking to people who might be able to help us develop a package there, whether it's somebody that's developed a platform that we could use as a basis for that. And then also last mile delivery. The other aspect of that is we've been looking at e-cargo bikes and also smaller micro electric vehicles, because I think that grey area between the two is quite an interesting space for urban mobility and last mile delivery in cities. So we're looking at people that can help us with that, and are interested in developing solutions for large fleet operators, whether it's home delivery of groceries or online shopping. And I think that's an area where, again, we're interested in people that can help us, where we're looking at material solutions, battery solutions, electric motors, anything where you can say, actually, together with all these ingredients, we could start to create a really interesting package.
Okay, fine. And what we'll do is we'll make sure we leave sort of contact details in the show notes. So, clearly any listener, certainly whether they're in Silverstone Park or Silverstone Technology Cluster, but actually, nationally, anybody that is listening to this thinking, okay, that sounds interesting, we'll make sure they've got a path to find you, which is good.
Thank you.
Clive, we've been recording for 33 minutes. Hasn't that whizzed through?
Motor mouth.
Well, that is good. So I think before we get on to the final two questions, I'm going to ask, is there anything that we haven't spoken about or covered off that, whilst we've got you on air and we've got you up from London, that you'd like to sort of talk about?
I think one of the things, I think we've covered, there's a lot we've covered actually. I think one of the things that has struck me is actually what design means. There's sometimes, I've been surprised when we've been talking to people how much we've had to explain what a typical project design process is for us. So I think being able to explain about how, in terms of simple transport design, you can go from 2D drawings and illustrations of what things could look like, how they could go together, through to digital models around technical packages. Being able to explain that process, I think, is really important to us, so we can show the value of it to our clients, and to say this is how we can make products easier to manufacture, easier to use, perform better because they're lightweight, there's a lower part count, and I think that's a really important part. I mean, obviously you want to make them look as nice and attractive as possible, because that's a natural impulse for anyone when they look at anything, but you also want, design can actually affect at a much deeper level than that, because it's about the application of creative thinking to problem solving. It's a bit like we were talking about with the sets we create for Lego Foundation. It's about a mindset of how can we use our creative faculties and skills to solve a problem, not just paint some nice colours on it, but actually make it perform better, fit better into a whole, apply it to something in an innovative way, so that you can make something become more than the sum of its parts. And I think that for us is a big part of what the value of design is. It's about making things better, but also helping companies then to tell that story in a better way and more clearly.
Okay, that's very good. Clive, I'm going to move on to the next question. This is a fun one. This is one where I typically watch our wonderful interviewees cringe and sink into their chair with a grimace. Yeah. Embarrassing mistakes. So we have the reason for it, and I'll explain for listeners who might not have heard any of the previous episodes. I think it's important to share mistakes and to laugh at ourselves. Because we're all human, right?
Yeah.
And so let's sort of humanise the situation. So is there anything in sort of your locker, Clive's locker, from a professional background, let's say, where in the past you've made a mistake, stupid mistake, or sort of cringed and thought, I wish I hadn't done that, but sort of lesson learned and sort of brush yourself off and sort of move forward?
Too many to mention.
Often the case, right?
I think one that pops in mind was actually only a few months ago was we were giving a presentation for another special interest group we're part of, and it was a PowerPoint presentation in front of an auditorium of 100 or so people, one of these short 3-minute kind of pitch things, and we had a deck that we prepared and sent off to the hosts beforehand, and what I hadn't realised was that the sort of auto slide kind of advance was actually activated on that. So everything that we had in the presentation was all about, a lot of our work is very visual, so it was all about referring to the images up there on the screen, except the images kept changing and moving forward.
Oh no.
to the point where it was kind of like, right, imagine that thing you saw 5 minutes ago.
And they couldn't rewind it.
You couldn't rewind it and hold it, right. Or at least because I'd not used the slideshow hardware they had before. And what it made me realise afterwards is that actually I think we were trying to kind of I was trying to say too much in that presentation, and it was a reminder of kind of when you're presenting something about keeping your focus and about keeping it short and sweet, which I'm not sure I've done today, but
no, compared to others it is. So
and being able to boil down what you do into something memorable and simple and straightforward. And I think that was one of those things, if I'd been able to do that better that day, I wouldn't have looked such an idiot standing in front of me. You just saw it there. It just went past.
Yeah, but I guess, it wasn't your fault, was it? But important lesson learned, as you said, condense it down to a few images, less is more, perhaps.
Yeah, totally.
Very good. Last question, and then I'm going to let you go back down to South London.
Yes.
we have, a broad range of listeners of ages, from students up to our more senior friends. But certainly for those that are, perhaps still studying or at the beginning of their entrepreneurial journey or their employed journey. This question's for them. So, you're clearly an absolute master in your field. Very impressive. Career today. The work that I've at least seen online, including the bike solution that you mentioned, which I looked at, I thought was very good. Through to everything else visually, clearly on point and very, very good. But there would have come a point earlier on where you were, still studying or entering your career where it would have been a little bit green, a little bit wet behind the ears.
Totally.
For all of us. So if you could go back to yourself then and say anything, one piece of advice, what would it be?
Never eat the yellow snow.
Never eat the yellow snow.
Seriously, I think one thing I feel I've learned a lot about, especially since we set up Quarteere, is the skills of listening and empathy. And I think I wished I'd been a bit savvier about that when I was younger, because it's sort of understanding somebody else's point of view, and even if you disagree with it, it's perhaps quite topical these days, understanding where they're coming from or why that might be, because even if you're not going to agree with it, it's finding, it helps you to see where there might be common ground, or where you can at least create or show an aspect of what you're doing that is sympathetic to the opinion and point of view of the other person. And I think whether that's understanding what your boss is looking for when you're a young designer in a design studio, or why they're asking you to make something look a certain way rather than thinking they're an idiot, or when you're dealing with a client, getting to know them and listening as carefully as possible to see where they're coming from, what direction they want to move in, so that you can make sure that what you do, while hopefully it's kind of opens their eyes and gives them new ideas, is also sympathetic to what they want. Because it's, too often I think you see that stereotype of a designer coming in with this is my artistic idea, and it's this or nothing. And sometimes that, sometimes you can hit the bullseye with that. But more often than not, actually, the unsung heroes are the ones that are doing a really good job listening and building those relationships and talking to people. And I think that, if I could go back and teach myself one lesson, I think it would be to kind of spend a bit less time talking, a bit more time listening to other people, and to understand where they're coming from and why.
Very sage advice, Clive. I love that. I think it's a very, very good bit of wisdom. So thank you very much for sharing that, and thank you for coming on the show and coming up from London to visit us in Silverstone. So,
pleasure.
As I said, I'll make sure there's some links in the show notes to help people sort of connect with you.
Great, thank you.
If they're looking for potentially sort of collaborative partnerships or otherwise. And I would wholeheartedly say to all the listeners, go onto the Quarteere website. Again, the link will be in the show notes, and have a look at some of their design work. Very, very, very impressive.
Thank you very much. Always
Clive,
happy to talk.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
The Inside Silverstone podcast is produced by the team at Longhurst for the benefit of those with a passion for all things tech, engineering and innovation. For more information, please visit longhurst.co.uk/Inside Silverstone, whilst also remembering to give us a 5 out of 5 star rating on iTunes. Please note that neither Chris Broome or Longhurst work for Silverstone Park, Silverstone Circuit or Silverstone Technology Cluster.